Today's mindful moment. All right, so picture this for a second.
Okay.
You're sailing across thousands of miles of open ocean
Oh, wow.
with no GPS, no compass, no modern instruments, just the stars, the currents, and the wind to guide you.
That's incredible.
That's exactly what Polynesian explorers were doing for centuries before Europeans even knew the Pacific existed.
It's mind-boggling when you think about the sheer scale of their voyages, right? They established a network across the Pacific that spanned an area larger than Europe.
It really puts our modern ideas of exploration into perspective, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
We're talking about the Polynesian Triangle here, stretching from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island, over 10 million square miles.
And what's amazing is that Captain James Cook, the explorer we're diving into today, was completely awestruck by their skill.
He even wrote about it in his journals, right?
Oh, absolutely. He marveled at their ability to navigate without the instruments he relied on.
It makes you realize how much we take for granted today.
Yeah, their connection to the natural world was on a whole other level.
And it's Cook's third and final voyage that we're focusing on in this deep dive. It was a journey full of mystery, controversy, and tragedy.
A lot of historians actually suggest that Cook was a changed man on this voyage, maybe even disillusioned with exploration.
Really? So different from his earlier voyages.
Well, he had retired after a second voyage, you know?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, settled into a comfortable life. But the lure of finding the Northwest Passage, that fabled sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific, pulled him back in.
It was a huge deal back then, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Especially with the American colonies slipping away from England.
Definitely a strategic priority for the British Empire.
But what about this change in Cook's demeanor? What do you think caused it?
There are a few theories.
Like what?
Well, for one, he seemed less interested in meticulous map-making on this voyage, charting every island he encountered.
Huh. That's different from the Cook we know from his earlier voyages.
Exactly. Well, in Tonga, for instance, he knew about Fiji and Samoa, but chose not to explore them. He even bypassed several Hawaiian islands on his initial visit. It's like he was laser-focused on the Northwest Passage.
Almost like a change in priorities.
Or a waning enthusiasm, perhaps. We can't know for sure.
But there's also the Grass Cove Massacre in New Zealand.
Yeah.
A pretty chilling event.
Yes, that's a dark chapter. A group of Cook's men went ashore to gather some greens, and things turned violent. The Maori killed all 10 of them in a ritualistic attack.
Wow, that's heavy.
It's a stark reminder of the cultural clashes that could happen during these encounters.
I can't imagine what that must have been like for Cook and his crew.
It must have been devastating.
So how did Cook respond to such a horrific act? Did he retaliate?
That's what's so interesting and maybe even controversial. He didn't retaliate with force. He actually pardoned the Maori chief responsible.
What? That seems pretty unexpected, given the time period.
You're telling me. His reasoning was that the killings weren't premeditated, but stemmed from escalating tensions and cultural misunderstandings.
To pardon the leader after such a brutal event? That's a tough call.
It was a decision that shocked many of his crew.
Oh, I bet.
They felt he was being weak, especially after such a shocking act. And then you have Omai, the Tahitian man who had sailed with Cook to England and back. He was outraged by the pardon.
Omai. Tell me more about him. I don't know much about his story.
Well, Omai had experienced both English and Tahitian society, so his perspective is really interesting.
Right. So why was he outraged?
He argued that in England, someone who committed such a crime would have been hanged without a second thought. Cook's leniency to him was baffling.
So Cook is caught between these two worlds, English and Tahitian, trying to find some balance in this complex situation.
It highlights the challenges of cross-cultural understanding, especially in those early days of contact.
Exactly. So many layers to unravel.
Now let's dive a bit deeper into Omai's story. It runs parallel to Cook's voyage and adds another layer of intrigue.
Sounds fascinating.
Oh, it is. Omai became quite the celebrity in England, He met the king, had his portrait painted by a famous artist, and was a popular guest at social gatherings.
Wow. Imagine going from a Tahitian island to the heart of London society in the 1700s.
It must have been a whirlwind. And he even received smallpox inoculations, cutting-edge medicine at the time.
They had that back then.
The very early stages, but yes.
That's incredible.
It is, but his return to Tahiti wasn't the triumphant homecoming he'd hoped for. He actually faced social challenges.
Like what?
Well, there was rivalry from another Tahitian chief named Tu, and he struggled to regain his former status.
From London high society back to the realities of his homeland.
Right. He tried to impress his people with his English possessions and knowledge, but it wasn't enough.
It's a reminder that cultural exchange can be a two-way street, with its own set of complexities.
Absolutely. And Cook, almost like a concerned father figure, decided to help Omai settle on the island of Huahin.
He did.
Yeah, he even built him a European-style house there.
You can almost feel Cook's empathy for Omai, can't you?
It's a very human element in this larger story of exploration and encounter.
Okay, so we've got this fascinating subplot with Omai unfolding, Cook seemingly a changed man, and now we're heading toward Hawaii, a place rich in ancient rituals and traditions.
It's where the story takes an even more intriguing turn.
I can't wait to dive into that.
Me neither. Okay, so close your eyes for a second and imagine this. Kealakekua Bay, on the big island of Hawaii. You're surrounded by these incredible cliffs and lush valleys.
Sounds beautiful.
Oh, it was. It was also a really important religious center for the Hawaiians, you know? Like a place where they connected with their gods and ancestors.
And it was into this sacred space that Cook sailed.
Yeah, unknowingly entering a world completely different from any he'd seen before.
I can't even imagine what that must have been like for both sides.
Right, and get this. He arrived during the Makahiki Festival. That's a 4-month celebration honoring Lono, the god of peace and fertility.
Wait, so Cook just happened to show up during this massive religious festival.
Yeah, talk about timing, right?
That must have been quite a sight for the Hawaiians.
It definitely was. Thousands of them lined the shores, over 1,000 canoes swarming the ships. A mix of awe, curiosity, maybe even a little fear, I imagine.
So this is where the whole Cook is Lono theory comes in. That the Hawaiians thought he was their god.
Exactly. The rituals they performed when he arrived really fueled that speculation.
Like what kinds of rituals?
Well, they offered him a red cloak, chanted, prostrated themselves before him, all actions usually reserved for their gods.
Wow. That's pretty convincing evidence.
Yeah, but there's actually a lot of debate about it. Some scholars say it's just us projecting Western ideas onto another culture.
Right, like we can't assume they thought the same way Europeans did.
Exactly. One anthropologist, Marshall Solins, argued that the Hawaiians genuinely saw Cook as Lono, like a manifestation of the god himself.
Okay, interesting.
But then Ganana Tobe-Seker, another scholar, challenged that whole view. He said it was a total misreading of Hawaiian culture.
So who's right? I guess we'll never really know what the Hawaiians truly believed.
It's one of those enduring historical mysteries. You know, we have the accounts from Cook's crew, but they're filtered through their own lens, and we don't have any written records from the Hawaiians themselves.
So much of history is lost, it's kind of sad.
It is, but that also makes it so fascinating to try and piece things together.
So this first encounter with the Hawaiians, it wasn't all sunshine and roses, was it? I mean, Cook returned to Kealakekua Bay later, and that's when things went downhill fast, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. That initial welcome, the awe and reverence, all gone. It was like a completely different atmosphere.
What happened? What caused that shift?
Well, a bunch of bad luck and escalating tensions basically led to the confrontation that ended Cook's life.
Okay, I'm listening.
One of the key incidents was the theft of a cutter from one of Cook's ships.
A cutter? What's that?
Oh, sorry. It's like a small, maneuverable boat, really important for all sorts of tasks. Ferrying supplies, scouting, communication between ships. So stealing it was a big deal. Okay, I get it. Like messing with their operations.
Exactly. A direct challenge to Cook's authority.
So how did Cook react?
Not well, I'm afraid. His patience was already wearing thin on this voyage. He actually tried to take the Hawaiian king hostage to get the cutter back.
Hostage? That seems extreme.
It does, right. You'd think he would learn from the whole Grass Cove situation and try a different approach.
Well, it sounds like he was under a lot of pressure. And maybe not thinking clearly.
That's probably true. And of course, this hostage attempt led to, well, a full-blown battle on the beach.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it got ugly fast. Several of Cook's Marines were killed, and
Yeah.
Cook himself. Well, he met a violent end there on the shores of Kealakekua Bay.
It's hard to believe that's how it all ended for him. And the story of what happened to his remains is pretty intense, too.
It really is. Only part of his body was returned to the ships. The Hawaiians said they'd burned the rest, but then they gave back a thigh bone. It's almost like something out of a myth or a legend. It's fascinating how even in death, Cook's story becomes intertwined with Hawaiian mythology. It's like his story became part of their story.
Right. And it's connected to Lono, too.
Oh yeah, how so?
Well, think about it. The Hawaiians believed that Lono would leave the island sailing westward, but he'd eventually come back again.
And Cook sailed west after leaving Hawaii, only to return to Kealakekua Bay later.
Exactly. It's almost too perfect, isn't it? That cyclical pattern mirroring the whole Lono belief. So did Cook's return make some Hawaiians even more convinced that he was a god? We can only speculate.
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? How our beliefs shape the way we see the world.
Totally. And we have to remember, we're talking about a time when the line between the human and the divine wasn't as clear cut as it is for many of us today.
So back in England,
Yeah.
how did people react to Cook's death?
Oh, it was huge news. He was a national hero,
I bet they were devastated.
Absolutely. There was grief, outrage, disbelief. It took a while for the news to travel back then, but when it did, it had a massive impact.
It's interesting how his death kind of solidified this idea of the noble explorer dying in a far-off land.
Yeah, and on the flip side, it also played into existing prejudices about savage cultures. The idea that people outside of Europe were dangerous and uncivilized.
So Cook's legacy is complicated. He expanded our knowledge of the world, but his voyages also paved the way for colonization.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how progress and discovery can have both positive and negative consequences. We can celebrate his achievements while also acknowledging the darker side of his story.
It reminds us that history isn't simple. There are always multiple perspectives to consider. So for you, what's the most important thing we can learn from Cook's story, especially this final voyage?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's a reminder of how easily things can go wrong when different cultures meet, especially when there are power imbalances and misunderstandings. And it forces us to think critically about the whole idea of exploration, the cost of discovery, the impact it had on Indigenous people.
It's a powerful reminder that history is full of unintended consequences. Well said. And on that note, if you're intrigued by Cook's story and want to learn more, be sure to check out The Wide, Wide Sea. It's a fascinating read. We've included a link in the show notes where you can purchase the book.
It's definitely worth a read. It really dives deep into Cook's voyages and the impact he had on the world.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive so you don't miss out on future episodes. We've got tons more fascinating stories to uncover.
And who knows, maybe we'll even tackle another one of history's great mysteries. Stay tuned.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Captain James Cook. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those mindful moments going.